and it sits right in the middle of the Amazon rainforest, right along the Amazon River, and it happens to be one of the most violent places in the entire world. All it takes in Manaus is simply walking down the wrong street or crossing the wrong person, and you can get shot or stabbed in broad daylight, and there's virtually nothing anyone can do to stop it. In 1989, a 31-year-old former police officer named Wallace Souza decided to make a TV show about what it was actually like to live in his hometown of Manaus. And unlike other crime shows in Brazil that often censored out the most graphic content they covered, Wallace decided he wasn't going to do that. He wanted to expose the harsh reality of life in Manaus, and he felt like the only way to do that was to show everything. And so that year, he launched this show, which he called Canal Livre, which translates roughly to free channel. And true to form, there was no filter on what went on the air. And so this show was shocking. Viewers were given a front row seat to freshly murdered victims that are lying out in the road and slumped over chairs in restaurants and behind steering wheels, and the cameraman would zoom in on their fatal injuries, and they would zoom in on the faces of these people that have just died. Every gratuitous detail, every blood spatter, every grieving family member of the victim who's crying out in pain, all of it was shown on this TV show. And then in between these very dark and violent segments about gang killings and drug deals going wrong, Canal Livre also had a much lighter side. They would bring on local artists to talk about what they're working on, to maybe try to sell some of their goods. The show would also focus on down-on-their-luck families that needed help raising some money, and so the show was designed to get people to donate. And then also, for really no reason at all, there was a segment on the show where this puppet character would get into a fight with a man selling bread. It was a totally bizarre and shocking spectacle, and the people of Manaus loved it. And then eventually, the people of Brazil loved it. I mean, this was an extremely popular show. Because Wallace was often on camera on Canal Livre, he became very famous and very recognizable. And so when he would walk around Manaus, people would see him and literally just start clapping and cheering for him. And as he and his show became more and more popular across South America, Wallace decided he didn't just want to report on crime, he wanted to fight crime. So, on air, Wallace began berating the government for not being able to protect its citizens, and he berated the police for not being able to catch the criminals. And then off the air, Wallace campaigned for and was elected to political office in Manaus, where he continued to push hard to reduce crime in the city. And so it wasn't long before Wallace went from just being a relatively well-known TV host to being one of the most beloved and influential and trustworthy people in all of Brazil. However, over the years, there was one strange thing about his show, Canal Livre, that people just couldn't wrap their heads around. This oddity was most obvious in a now famous episode of Canal Livre that aired sometime in the mid-2000s. This episode opens with a Canal Livre reporter making their way through a jungle, and there's a cameraman filming them from behind. And this reporter, they're very carefully walking through, kind of pushing branches out of the way and high-stepping over all the underbrush. And then at some point up ahead, you see there is a clearing, and there is a third person standing in this clearing, and they're clearly looking straight down at something on the ground that we can't see. But this third person is very occupied with whatever is on the ground. And so eventually, this reporter makes their way through the jungle into this clearing, and then as soon as the cameraman gets into the clearing as well, he looks down at what is on the ground. And what you see is what appears to be a log that has previously been lit on fire because it's still smoking and it's black and it's charred. But as the cameraman zooms in, you see there are hands on this log. So you realize it's not a log, it's a human being who's obviously deceased. And based on how badly charred they are and how much they're still smoking, you realize very quickly that this person must have been on fire very recently as probably just a couple of minutes ago. Like right before the camera got here, this person was on fire. And so as you're kind of seeing this shocking image, the reporter suddenly talks about this person like he knows all the details of them already. He says, this person, it's a man, and they were not shot to death, they were doused with gasoline and burned alive. But at this point, the police had not come out. They had not seen this dead person yet, and so it made no sense that the reporter would have all this information on hand, because No one knows this stuff yet, and based on just looking at this person's body, it was too badly burned to be able to tell whether it was a man or whether they had been shot or not, or whether gasoline was used. But when Wallace was questioned about where he and his reporters got their information from, he just said, look, we're a very popular show and people call us often before they call the police, and they give us information about what's happening in the city, and we have a huge team. We watch the police headquarters, we listen to the police's radio, we watch the morgue, we have loads of informants all over the city, and so we just get our information really, really quickly. And this answer was enough until 2008. That year, in October, the police arrested a former Manaus police officer who just went by the name Moa, and they accused him of 9 murders. And so they throw him in jail, but Moa, despite the seriousness of the charges against him, seems totally unfazed. It was obvious he had some sort of powerful connection outside of prison, some person or some entity that he fully expected was going to, at any moment, swoop in and magically get him out of prison. But that didn't happen. Moa just continued to sit in jail, and at some point that began to sink in that he was kind of on his own, and so he began to talk. And the story he would tell would shock Brazil. Moa would admit to having killed some people, but he would tell police, look, I'm just the assassin. The person who hired me for these killings is Wallace Souza. It would turn out Wallace Souza started his show, Canal Livre, with the best of intentions. But when his show became massively popular, and it in turn made him, Wallace, also massively popular and powerful, he became corrupt. And at some point, after his meteoric rise, he formed this very powerful drug cartel, and then in an effort to bolster his illegal dealings and to boost his show's ratings, he decided to start contracting hitmen like Moa to start taking out rival gang members in Manaus. And he would tell the hitman how he wanted them killed and where he wanted them killed and at what time. And then after the hitman agreed to do this, he, Wallace, would go tell his camera crews exactly where to go and at what time so that they would be arriving at the murder scene literally right as it was happening or right afterwards, allowing them the opportunity to get all the gory footage before anybody else. It would take the police a year to finally compile enough evidence to charge Wallace with murder, but they would do it in October of 2009, and eventually Wallace would turn himself in. However, he denied everything. And then before he went to trial, he would die of a heart attack in prison. And so we never actually got to learn the full extent of what exactly Wallace Souza had done, how many people he had assassinated, and how many of them were shown on his TV show. But we do know that at least 3 of his assassination victims were shown on his TV show, one of them being the person that was found out in the jungle. They really were a man. They really had not been shot. They had been burned alive with gasoline at Wallace's discretion. But in the end, the person who paid the highest price for the Canal Livre killings was Moa, the hitman who blew the whistle on what was going on with the show. On New Year's Day in 2017, a crime syndicate overran the prison where Moa was being held. Now, they had lots of targets of people they were going there to kill, and one of them was Moa. They were furious with him that he spoke to police and gave up information about the drug trade in Brazil. And so eventually, this angry mob of gangsters made their way over to Moa's cell, and when they found him, he was pressed up against the back of his cell wall, basically as far away from the bars as he possibly could be, and he began pleading for his life, and this horde was not having it. They were only there to kill him. So they all have machetes and knives, and they're looking at him through the bars, and they say, we're gonna come in there, we're gonna cut you to pieces. And so then they start banging on the door, they're trying to hack the lock open, and Moa, he can't do anything. All he can do is kind of just keep himself all the way to the back of the cell and hope they don't get in, and eventually they can't open the door, and they know it. And so they do the next best thing. They reach through the bars with a lighter and they light Moa's mattress on fire. And so Moa was trapped. He had nowhere to go, and so eventually the fire reached him and he burned alive.
Death to the pretender.
In 2010, 18-year-old Renee Marsden was living in Sydney, Australia with her parents and her 3 siblings. Renee was a very outgoing person who had a big circle of friends, and she was also very close with her family, especially her mom, Teresa. Teresa had given birth to Renee when she was only 19 years old, and so now that Renee was a young woman, because of their closeness in ages, the two had become very close friends instead of mother and daughter. And so because of that dynamic, Renee found herself always going to her mother to tell her anything going on in her life. She was her confidant. And that year, something major had disrupted Renee's life, and so naturally she went to her mom and she told her about it. It would turn out Renee's boyfriend of nearly 2 years, who she was madly in love with, well, she discovered he was cheating on her and didn't actually even care about her. He had sent these text messages that basically said as much. And so she confronted her boyfriend with these text messages, and he denied ever sending them. He said, "Look, I've never cheated on you. I don't know where those came from. I promise I've been faithful to you this entire time." But Renee just wasn't buying it, and so she had felt forced to break up with him. And so Renee naturally had turned to her mother for comfort and guidance, but Teresa, all she could really offer her daughter was, to remind her that time heals all wounds, and that certainly someday you will meet the right person for you. And amazingly, only a couple of weeks after this very painful breakup, Renee came home from work one day and she walked into the house and she was all smiles. And considering how unbelievably depressed she had been over the last couple of weeks, this really stood out. And so when her mom saw her smiling and radiating happiness, she rushed over to her and said, "What's gotten into you? Why are you in such a good mood?" And Renee would tell her that, "Actually, I've met another guy." And so Teresa said, Who did you meet? Who is this person?" And she would tell her mom that his name is Braden Spiteri. He was 23 years old, and he was a graduate of the King's School, which is a really prestigious boys' school in Sydney. And his father was this really successful business person who owned this big construction company that he was set to inherit later on. And so she was just raving about how amazing this guy was. And Teresa was really happy. If nothing else, this was a very good distraction for her. And so she asked her daughter at some point, "How'd you meet this guy?" And Renee would tell her that Camilla had introduced them. Camilla Zaidan was Renee's best friend. They had met in high school. And Renee would explain to her mother that Braden was actually Camilla's ex-boyfriend, but they hadn't dated in a really long time, and there was no feelings between them. They were just friends at this point. And apparently, after Renee had this really painful breakup, Camilla had just felt bad for her, and so she had gone out and found the best possible match for Renee, which in her mind was this guy Braden. Teresa knew Camilla really well because she was always over the house, and she knew Teresa's intentions must have been good, but she's thinking to herself, this is bad news. You don't want to have best friends, one dating the ex-boyfriend of the other. It's just bad news waiting to happen. And so Teresa couldn't even help herself, and she says to her daughter, "Do you really think it's a good idea to be dating Camilla's ex-boyfriend?" But Renee would tell her mom, "Look, Camilla was totally upfront with me. She just wants me to be happy. She thinks Braden is a good match for me. They don't have feelings anymore, not at all. She's totally in support." And so Teresa still very much had her doubts that this was a good idea. But she put those doubts aside, and instead she said, "Okay, well, can you show me a picture of Braden? Can I see what he looks like?" And so Renee pulls out her phone and she finds a picture of Braden and she shows it to her mom. And right away, her mom is looking at this picture and seeing that Braden is a very handsome guy, big bright smile. But she sees in this picture, Camilla is very clearly laying on his shoulder like she is his girlfriend. And so again, Teresa's thinking to herself, this is not good. Someone is going to get hurt. But over the next couple of weeks and months, Renee and Braden texted each other all the time. Renee had her phone out basically 24/7 talking to Braden. The pair had made plans to meet up and see each other in person for the first time on several different occasions, but every single time they were set to go meet, one of them would have a conflict that would make it impossible to have this face-to-face meeting. And so before long, when they just could not get a meeting established, they kind of stopped trying to have face-to-face meetings. It was almost like they had built this really strong, flourishing relationship all via their phones, and it just was getting more and more awkward to actually go out and see each other in real life. It was just more comfortable doing it all on their phones. And so this digital-only relationship between Renee and Braden continued for almost a year until January of 2012, when something horrible happened. Braden was in a horrible motorcycle accident. He survived the accident, but his passenger, his best friend, this guy named Richie, who was riding right on the back of his motorcycle, he didn't survive. He was killed in the accident. And it was determined that Braden was driving recklessly, and so he was charged with manslaughter and convicted and sentenced to 2 years in prison. Even though Renee's mother, Teresa, was totally upset about this accident, I mean, she did understand someone had lost their life and now Braden was going to jail for 2 years. She understood the seriousness of this accident.